In 2009, Ken Burns released a 6-part documentary series about the evolution of national parks titled The National Parks, America's Best Idea. The National Park Service claims that the title is a reference to Wallace Stegner's article, The Best Idea We Ever Had, an overview from 1983. Stegner wrote that the national parks were absolutely America, absolutely democratic, and that they reflect us at our best rather than our worst. However, Stegner himself seemed to disagree with being credited for coining the phrase. In the same year, William C. Everhart credited conservationist Marty Murray, but his citation is vague. He can only say Murray originated it a few years ago. Later, in an article for the Smithsonian in 1990, Stegner himself credits it to James Bryce, a British ambassador from the early 1900s. And while Bryce wrote very kindly of the national parks in his singular work on the topic, he never explicitly calls it America's best idea. So either Stegner is incorrect in crediting Bryce, is crediting him in concept rather than in phrase, or has completely imagined the phrase altogether. But regardless, I think it's safe to say that a lot of people have and do believe that the concept of a national park is one of the United States' most significant global contributions across history. And yet, as of the filming of this video, the US government has laid off roughly 1,000 National Park Service employees and even more from the Forest Service. The president wants to drill for oil in 18 more national parks, which would bring the number up to 30, and has stated interest in increasing logging as well. So today, if the consensus is to cut and drill, why was the consensus back in the day, hell, 10 years ago, that these things are genius? And it begs the question, what do national parks do? In 1969, the IUCN noted 3 defining characteristics of national parks. 1. Within the area, there are 1 or more ecosystems which are unaltered by human intervention or occupation that are of scientific, educational, or recreational interest. 2. The highest governing body of the country has taken steps to prevent or eliminate exploitation or occupation of the whole area, and is making efforts to enforce respect of the ecological, geomorphological, or aesthetic features that make the area significant. And 3. Visitors are permitted to enter the park for inspirational, educational, cultural, and/or recreative purposes. In 1971, the IUCN made a few additional notes. The minimum size of the area in which preservation takes priority in a national park should be at least 1,000 hectares. The legal protection of the park should be statutory, which basically means to be formally written down. The budget and staff to protect the park should be considered sufficient, which means they should be doing a good job at it, essentially. And exploitation of natural resources within the park should be prohibited. So basically, not every park that calls itself a national park follows these exact specifications. And in other cases, a park does match the criteria, but refers to itself as a reserve or a preserve. So this definition kind of means nothing, but it's still a good baseline. Like in a much more general sense, we can gather that a national park is a nature area designated for conservation purposes and managed by the highest level of government. And it's typically designated because it holds natural, historic, or cultural significance. The first national park was Yellowstone. It was 1872, and the Second Industrial Revolution was picking up speed. Less and less people were living in the natural world. As cities grew, they not only became the place to be, but also the place to escape. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, and when you're in a city looking over the fence at Yellowstone, that is especially true. As less and less people experience the outdoors every day, appreciation for it and natural sciences were on the rise. And of course, with the rapid expansion of these cities came the question of where to draw the line and stop developing. And then, the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition returned from their exploration of Yellowstone in 1870. They returned with detailed observations written by Cornelius Hedges, and they published in a Montana-based newspaper. In his writings, and with the support of other expedition members, Hedges calls on an idea from a former Montana governor to set aside Yellowstone for conservation. A year later, in 1871, the Hayden expedition conducts a geological survey of Yellowstone. The team is massive, including 2 botanists, a meteorologist, an ornithologist, a mineralogist, a hunter, a physician, an entomologist, a topographer, a myriad of cooks, assistants, coordinators, and 3 visual artists. And those 3 visual artists are photographer William Henry Jackson and artists Thomas Moran and Henry Elliott. The scientists on the expedition were able to prove that Yellowstone was in a category of its own. and the artists were able to show the rest of the world that fact. With a vast majority of the public's approval, the expeditioners supported a bill in 1872 that referenced the precedent set by Yosemite's Act of 1864, which entrusted the valley to the state of California and protected it from settlement. But, unlike Yosemite, the area of Yellowstone crossed multiple state borders, making it unclear which one should manage the entirety of the park. So instead, the government decided to bring control up to the federal level. And so, the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act was signed into law by President Ulysses S. Grant on March 1st, 1872. Quote, "The headwaters of the Yellowstone River is hereby reserved and withdrawn from settlement, occupancy, or sale, and dedicated and set apart as a public park or pleasuring ground for the benefit and enjoyment of the people." A couple acts that follow Yellowstone are worth noting. The Antiquities Act, 1906. This authorized the president to proclaim a location a historic landmark, based on the presence of historic or prehistoric structures and objects of historic or scientific interest. So think cave paintings, George Washington's house, geysers, stuff like that. It also prevented the excavation of antiquities on federal lands without permission from whatever department has jurisdiction over it. The Organic Act, 1916. This is the act that established the National Park Service and its philosophy, and then placed all of the existing parks under it. Previously, Yellowstone had been under the care of various unpaid superintendents, including Langford of the Washburn-Langford-Doane expedition, and then later under the care of the U.S. Army for the sake of further law enforcement. The other 14 national parks in existence at the time had their own separate management. And this left the national parks vastly directionless. Having the NPS manage all of the national parks gave them a sense of uniformity, their own dedicated paid rangers, and collective goals. And that follows us into Mission 66 of 1956. Experiencing an uptick in visitors after World War II, the National Park Service persuaded Congress to fund a massive upgrade to national parks, set to complete on the National Park Service's 50th anniversary in 1966. Mission 66 built visitor centers, employee residences, and roads. The NPS director, Conrad Worth, led this mission, and you can still see his low-maintenance, prefabricated Park Service modern architectural stylings in parks today. The Wilderness Act of 1964. This provided additional legal protection for parks with the intention of securing natural areas in the long term for the benefit of future generations. The National Trail System Act of 1968. This act established the Appalachian Trail and the Pacific Crest Trail. The intention of this act was to create accessible hiking nationwide, in rural and urban areas, and for people of all physical abilities. There are 4 classes of trails under this act. There are National Scenic Trails, National Historic Trails, National Recreation Trails, and Side and Connecting Trails. The National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. This is the United States Basic Charter for Environmental Protection. Not long after the establishment of Yellowstone National Park, Australia established the world's second national park, Royal, located in Tasmania. Canada followed in 1885 with Banff in the Rocky Mountains, and then New Zealand in 1887 with Tongariro National Park. Today, there are more than 4,000 national parks across the globe. But they don't just sit there and look pretty. These locations are famous, and everyone knows that they're better in person, so they flock to them every summer. That means paying for visitor passes, staying in campgrounds and hotels, eating at local restaurants, and seeing other nearby attractions. All of those places, including the parks, need staff, so that is money and jobs for the given country. The U.S. Department of the Interior, for example, reported record high spending in areas around national parks in 2023. That's a $55.6 billion boost to the country's economy and 415,400 jobs. The NPS reported similar numbers that year, 325.5 million visitors, who in total spent around $26.4 billion in communities near national parks. That's $19.4 billion in labor income, meaning that people working in and around national parks in 2023 took home $19.4 billion in total income. The NPS estimates that the highest economic contributor related to national parks was lodging, hotels, campgrounds, Airbnbs, at $9.9 billion and 89,200 jobs. And those are just the direct benefits. The indirect effects of national parks go a lot further. The Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society explains it really well. A 2013 study estimates that the total global value of nature's ecosystem services will be up to 125 trillion USD per year. These services include air quality control, water filtration, climate regulation, carbon storage, wildlife habitat, and erosion control. In other words, a lot of industries rely on the healthy natural environments that are protected by the title of national park. Agriculture, forestry, and fisheries are all sectors that would be negatively impacted by the loss of ecosystems. Nature plays a huge role in these businesses. A loss in air or water quality, rapid changes in annual temperatures, or animals seeking new habitats could really mess with massive industries. For example, a 50% reduction in wild pollination would result in a $53 million Canadian annual reduction in the value of Canadian fruit production. The WEF believes that 44 trillion USD is threatened by nature loss worldwide. This also leaks into the healthcare system. According to that Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society report, contact with nature has been shown to lower blood pressure and strengthen your immune system. There was also an article from 2020 that found 60% of survey participants reported feeling less stressed after visiting a protected park. Not to mention that people are more likely to exercise when they're in and around national parks. What this all amounts to is healthier people, both physically and mentally. And while that's great on its own and doesn't need any further justification, healthy people are also less likely to need certain healthcare services, meaning parks can mitigate pressure on healthcare systems in the long term. And people with good stress reduction strategies are also more effective in the workplace and in their personal endeavors. But there is more to life than profit and numbers. Like I said before, national parks contribute to air and water quality worldwide. Spaces dedicated to healthy ecosystems are not self-contained. Their benefits are widespread. It also makes them a very effective respite from urban spaces with a lack of noise and light pollution, as well as that good air quality. It's actually one of the core ideas behind the creation of the NPS and national parks as a whole. A place where potential for economic gain through development is ignored in favor of a respite from urban life. If you remember my video on the Terra Nova expedition, I mentioned that the weather data collected during that trip is still being used today to track the path of climate change. That's the kind of long-term data that we can't always foresee needing, but usually ends up being incredibly relevant to future issues. It's also the kind of research that's being done in national parks. If a scientist were to just pick a random spot to take data from, there would be no guarantee that it would still be there in 5, 10, 20 years. The place where I'm filming right now, for example, could become a mall, a highway, a condo, anything with enough time. And that's the scale that these studies need to operate at to get meaningful data. In the United States, there are active research projects in almost 300 of the 417 national park sites. All of the data collected in the U.S. national parks are stored by the NPS, making a massive database of baseline information from our time, just like the Terra Nova expedition gave us in 1910. There's a study right now happening in Death Valley, Mojave, and Joshua Tree National Parks surveying birds. This project by UC Berkeley will span 10 years to track how birds are handling the changing climate. And in this project, they're referencing data taken by biologist Joseph Grinnell, director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology at UC Berkeley in 1908. When Grinnell took this data, he said that he suspected his work would not be truly appreciated for a century. And he was right. Some of the most important archaeological, ecological, and meteorological discoveries have been made in national parks. Willard Libby developed carbon-14 dating in Tool Springs Fossil Beds National Monument to date Pleistocene-era fossils. Durward Allen's research on predator-prey dynamics between wolves and moose in the Isle Royale National Park changed how we approach wildlife management for the better. We learned even more about predators and their roles in ecosystems by studying Yellowstone National Parks, where wolves had been completely eradicated, and this research led to the reintroduction of gray wolves back into the park in the mid-1990s. Several national parks contain glaciers, and tracking the ways they change let us track the wider effects of the rise in global temperature. And a lot of research here in North America is dedicated to forest fires, how to suppress them, when they might happen, when we might need them to happen, and how they change the structure of our forests. And given recent events in California, I think this is one of the most important projects happening in national parks right now. Now, I've seen a lot of people call environmentalists too emotional. So when I talk about conservation, I try to keep my arguments logical. But if I could get sentimental for a second without, totally losing you, I will. Look at this shit. Can you put a dollar amount on bulldozing this? Because I can't. In a previous video, I talked about how bison will never be able to roam free in North America again because of the infrastructure we've built on this continent. Without national parks, there would be nowhere for wildlife to live without crossing our roads, entering residential neighborhoods, and becoming backyard nuisances. I feel like those animals deserve a place to live, especially somewhere where they don't have to deal with us. And when it comes to us, I want to have these wonders around for the rest of my life and longer. I have a lot of these places on my bucket list, and I would be so disappointed if they started falling off the map before I'd saved enough money to travel. that's already happening in some places because of forest fires, so let's not pile onto it. I mean, seriously, I had a job lined up in Jasper National Park, but I had to cancel it because I couldn't find housing, and that summer, a good chunk of Jasper completely burned down, including the town where a lot of park staff live, and the site that I was going to be working on. Parks, be it state, provincial, or national, are there for you when you need them. Sitting there, looking gorgeous, and holding the wonders of our world within them. That's special, and that needs to stick around.